Tonight we're going to talk about synthesizers in music. It's the second part of this month's webinar. The first part last week we talked about synthesizers, the very first one that was created in 1897, the telharmonium, and we followed the development of synthesizers and the use of them in music throughout the 20th century, or rather the first half of the 20th century. And we finished our overview last week in the late 60s, so now we pick up this week with the 70s, and we continue to look at the role of synthesizers in music all the way up to the present day. So today's webinar is structured differently from last week's. Uh, Instead of isolating the different pieces of hardware, the synthesizers themselves, because there begin to be so many of them, we basically are just going to hone in on certain synthesizers during certain decades. So we'll take a look at the 70s as synth still emerged as kind of a new sound, and then the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s when synths became universal. One thing before we go further is that I know I had to omit many, many classic recordings and artists from this overview. And I hope to examine in more detail these specific artists that were not included, as well as those who are just glossed over in this overview. There's many, many interesting works out there by talented artists from throughout the decades and today. And I hope to use future webinars to go into more detail about the specific artists that I'm covering here. So that's a long-winded way of saying that it's an overview and I'm not covering everything. So let's start with the 70s, where the Moog modular synth was still a very popular item and really one of the main synths in use at the time. We saw from last week how uh, Wendy Carlos had used the Moog modular synthesizer to great effect for the Switched on Bach albums, which achieved great prominence um, in the charts in the late 60s, were quite popular. And by the early 70s, Moog was branching out into a series of other synthesizers. One of the most ambitious projects was the Moog Constellation, the Apollo, the Lyra, and the Taurus, a combination synth which included a polyphonic synthesizer. That was part of a collaboration that Moog had with Keith Emerson, who is well known as a fantastic keyboard and synth player whose group Emerson, Lake and Palmer was extremely popular in the 70s, and Keith Emerson helped to popularize the use of synthesizers in rock and roll, especially through this solo. That was Lucky Man, a big hit for Emerson, Lake and Palmer in 1973. Keith Emerson using the Moog. Another Moog hit in the early 70s was a song, instrumental called Popcorn. It had originally come out in a album by Gershon Kingsley, a electronic music pioneer. But the instrumental band that was put together by Stan Free called Hot Butter was the one who managed to generate a top 10 hit in the US and really brought synthesizers closer to awareness for many people. And even at this stage, the synthesizer was still sort of a novelty act. In Germany, Tangerine Dream was one of the premier pioneers of use of the synthesizer. Their albums throughout the 70s and onward, or are heavy with synthesizer tones and ambient features. They used a combination of synthesizers, Moogs, and also in the 70s, the ARP series, especially the 2500, was in use by musicians, including Paul Bley, a jazz pianist, who put out an interesting album this back in 72 with Annette Peacock, which included his use of the ARP 2500 and Moog, and her vocals also running through synthesizer and treated in various ways. For rock fans, the very famous synthesizer is sound and run is generated by this portable synthesizer put out by EMS called the Synthi AKS. Pink Floyd, in their famous recording Dark Side of the Moon, a couple of the tracks on that album feature this synthesizer, and they were one of the first 70s bands to introduce synthesizer into rock music. Another pioneer who also used this same EMS synthesizer is Brian Eno, who would originally start out with Roxy Music, then broke off to do his own music and released a series of cornerstone albums using this early synthesizer. Here Come the Warm Jets, Taking Tiger Mountain, and Another Green World, all considered now to be synthesizer classics and really precursors of much of what was to come, including the entire genre of New Age. Also in the 70s, the Mini Moog became extremely popular. It was a more portable and more updated Moog. Here's some tones from the Mini Moog. Okay, you can hear the rich fat tones and you'll recognize it in many solos. One famous keyboardist of the 70s who used the Mini Moog was Jan Hammer, who here is pictured with the famous jazz rock group, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, led by John McLaughlin. This is their first album. It featured the Mini Moog, and here is Chick Corea, who also used the Mini Moog in his famous jazz fusion album, Return to Forever. Also in the 70s in Germany again, Kraftwerk put out an album called Autobahn, which featured the title track. Autobahn was a long audio collage using many different types of synthesizers. Kraftwerk used synthesizers throughout their career and still today are considered to be one of the founding musicians of the dance genre and a huge influence on synth musicians from the 70s on to the present day. The Polymoog also came out in the late 70s, and one well-known sound sample of the Polymoog comes from Gary Newman, who had a #1 hit in 1979 with Bars. That was the Polymoog in action. Also in the late 70s now, transitioning basically coming into the 80s era of synth pop. Another early synth pop pioneer used the Roland System 100, and this is Martin Ware, who worked with a band called the Human League and used the Roland, the System 100 extensively with his work with the Human League. And this brings us into the 80s. And although this particular synthesizer, the Yamaha CS80, came out in the 70s, its sound is very well known in the 80s. Here's some samples of the CS80. Vangelis, the composer Vangelis, did a soundtrack for the movie in the early 80s, Chariots of Fire, and in 1981 his recording won the Best Original Score and was extremely another huge hit that once again emphasized the synthesizer as a compositional tool. Another band, Depeche Mode, in the 80s was using synthesizers heavily throughout the recordings. Um, an interesting synth from the 80s is the Electric Dream Plant, the Wasp. This is an English company based in Cambridge. Let's listen to a few of these sounds from the Wasp. One well-known band that used the Wasp was Duran Duran. The keyboardist Nick Rhodes of the band Duran Duran used the Wasp, as did others. Another synthesizer that came out in the 80s was the ARP Odyssey. Some sounds of the ARP Odyssey. The ARP Odyssey was used on such hits as ABBA's Gimme Gimme Gimme, and all the way to a very emerging early scene in Detroit with a couple of DJs who recorded under the moniker Cybertron, used that same synthesizer. Another synthesizer from the 80s that gained prominence was the Prophet 5. The Prophet 5 was an extremely high-end synthesizer, and you can hear it used on albums such as the Talking Heads, Speaking in Tongues, on Michael Jackson's Thriller, and on Madonna's Like a Virgin. Also in the 80s, but to become extremely popular in the 80s and acid house scene, the Roland TB303, and that was used on such things as such albums and releases as acid tracks by the artist Future. Here's the Roland Juno 106, a well-known synthesizer, also that came out in the 80s. Has been employed by artists ever since. Now we come into the 90s. In the 90s is where we really start to see these synths from the 70s and the 80s being used by artists who are just coming of age in the 90s. For example, here is an Akai MPC-60 drum machine, and here's a Roland TR-808, this is a famous drum machine, programmable drum machine that was used by a variety of artists throughout the 90s. Aphex Twin, there was even a band named after the 808 State, and from Germany, Mouse on Mars, from England, Boards of Canada, or Scotland rather, um, and from well, Chicago, essentially Stereolab, a rock and roll group who employed vintage synthesizers in their sound. Um, Also coming out or used earlier or issued earlier, the Korg MS-20. Here's a picture of the MS-20. Was used in the 90s then by, for example, the French duo Air, by Radiohead on their Kid A album. And the only real synthesizer then in the 90s that is heavily featured, that came out in 99, is the Korg Triton. Here's some sounds of the Triton. The Korg Triton was heavily used by the Neptune brothers and Timbaland producers in the late 90s, who gained fame then in the 2000s for many of their productions and remixes. And so that brings us to the 2000s, and that's when we really begin to see the rise of the software, of the virtual synthesizer, the software synthesizer. The development of portable high-speed computers uh, allowed fantastic amounts of sound and generating capability to be programmed into software that could be carried around in a laptop and a briefcase. So what once took up, for example, an entire city block or an entire room of a building, or perhaps an entire side of a stage, now could be inside of a laptop. And this is where things begin to also move full circle, where not only did there still be a thirst for the equipment from the 80s and 90s, and 70s and 80s, 90s, the older synthesizers that are still out there, but there also was the development, which continues today, of the emulation, the digital emulation of the sounds of old analog synthesizers. So for example, now you can get a plug-in that will emulate the sound of a Roland Juno or of a Minimoog. So the big uh, software packages for now, the recording studio, the synthesizer, the mixer, the sequencers, everything now merged into one, basically one software package. Apple's Logic was an early one that became adopted by many electronic musicians. Here's a screenshot from Logic. Reason, another software used by composers and performers, and Ableton Live, software once again used for performances as well as compositions. And there even now became computer language that was specifically designed for sound. For example, Max MSP, which is actually a programming language for not only sound but also video, began becoming available, as well as did many other languages. And so we go into the 2000s with artists such as M83 and Daft Punk releasing, and Fortet taking the sounds from the previous decades, and in using them in new and different ways. And by now the use of the synthesizer has completely saturated the pop music market, so that it's no longer really possible to track individual artists or even into individual pieces of hardware and trace their effects, because synthesizers at this point have become universal. So we reach the end of our talk tonight. Just to sort of quickly summarize the gear that we covered in the 70s, we took a look at the Mini Moog, the ARP 2500, the Roland 100, the EMS Synth AKS, and the Poly Moog. And in the 80s, we saw the development of the EDP Wasp, the famous Yamaha CS80, the Roland Juno 106, the Korg MS-20, the Roland TB303, and the Prophet 5, all um, famous sounds that are now emulated digitally in many different uh, variations. In the 90s, then the Korg Triton, um, the Akai MPC 60, and the Roland TR-8. I actually think those two are 80s, but became sort of prominent in their usage in the 90s. And then the 2000s, we saw the rise of software and programming languages, and really the disappearance of analog synthesizers, until we start actually talking about today, where there still is the manufacture of many different types of analog synthesizers. Korg, Moog, and other companies still are releasing and continue to develop analog synthesizers, because many users find that they still prefer that audio experience. So thank you for listening tonight. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach me at barrett@dcbclub.com. DCB Club is a sound lab that I have founded and run in DC for the past 3 years. It travels around to community centers, libraries, residences, anywhere where we can have music experiences for kids. It's a way for kids to experience synthesizers and drum machines and other electronic music. So I will be back again next month with another topic. Thank you for listening. Good night.